Oh, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here for our February History Café, Indigenous Forestry. Thank you all for braving a cold night, and thank you to those of you who are tuning in via live stream. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. History Café as a series is presented in partnership with HistoryLink and the Pacific Northwest Historians Guild on the third Wednesday of every month. HistoryLink is a wonderful resource as the largest free online encyclopedia of Washington state history. The Pacific Northwest Historians Guild brings together scholars concerned with the study and dissemination of regional history. If you need a restroom, they're to the left and just past this bright red high heel shoe down the hallway and on your left. A little run of show for tonight. We'll have an amazing presentation by tonight's speaker, followed by some audience Q&A. As we ground in the space and think about forestry and the land that we're on, it's important to recognize that here at MOHAI, we're on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this place with lasting impact on the land, water, and people. Therefore, it's critical that we hold deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. We encourage you to visit the websites and cultural institutions of local tribes to learn more about the people whose land you're on. Tonight's speaker, Gary Morishima, has served as technical advisor for national resources to the president of the Quinault Indian Nation since 1978, after establishing the tribe's forestry program. Morishima was born in the Tule Lake incarceration camp, which was established by the United States for Japanese Americans who lived along the West Coast during World War II. Before earning his doctoral degree in quantitative science and environmental management from the University of Washington, he worked as a systems analyst with the Boeing Company, where he was honored as a recipient of a Pride in Excellence Award. Please welcome tonight's speaker, Gary Morishima.
Well, good evening. Can you all hear me okay? I'm Gary Morishima. I'm here to talk a little bit about Quinault Forest stewardship today. And hopefully those of you with open eyes and open minds will learn a few things. What I'm going to talk about today is not taught in textbooks in schools. It's not the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But in Indian country, we approach resource management with the standpoint of 4 R's. And that's respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and relationships. Just a little bit about me. Thank you for the introduction. I'm a Husky from the University of Washington. From actually the Center for Forestry, Fisheries, and Wildlife at the University of Washington. I graduated from there many decades ago now. I serve as technical advisor to the president of the Quinault Indian Nation for natural resources and the environment. And in that capacity, I serve a variety of roles in terms of forest management, fisheries management, climate change, and policy. Today's purpose is really to provide you with a foundation for understanding how the Quinault Nation approaches stewardship of the forests. Really a concept of oneness, that we are not apart from the environment, but rather a part of the environment. I think that many of the things that I'm going to talk about here really center around a different way of thinking, different perspectives. And hopefully I'll give you some food for thought and give you an idea that there are really different ways of viewing the world and different views of viewing the parts of it. And it all depends upon perception. And perception itself depends upon time, place, and circumstance, what you've been taught in school, what you think you believe, and what you think you know. Um, but in Indian country, it's quite different than that. That their perspective is one of oneness, that we are part of everything else, and everything else is a part of us. So I think it's important that when we talk about forest management in Indian country, we don't talk really about managing individual resources. We talk about respect. And how do you respect the environment, your relationship to it? And how do you care for the land, care for the water, and all things that crawl, walk, swim, fly, or grow roots? I'd like to really open this session with a poem from Clarence Pickernell, who was a 6th grade teacher at the school in Tohola. Tohola is sort of the capital of the Quinault Reservation. He wrote this poem back in the late 1960s, but it really epitomizes the approach and the relationship of Quinaults to their environment. This is my land, from the time of the first moon to the time of the last sun. It was given to my people. Wane, Wane, the great giver of life, made me out of the earth of this land. He said, "You are the land, and the land is you." I take good care of this land, for I am a part of it. I take good care of the animals, for they are my brothers and sisters. I take care of the streams and rivers, for they clean the land. I honor ocean as my father, for he gives me food and a means of travel. Ocean knows everything, for he is everywhere. Ocean is wise, for he is old. Listen to ocean, for he speaks wisdom. He sees much and knows more. He says, "Take care of my sister Earth. She is young and has little wisdom, but much kindness. When she smiles, it is springtime. Scar not her beauty, for she is beautiful beyond all things. Her face looks eternally upwards to the sky and stars, where she once lived with her father sky. I am forever grateful for this beautiful and bountiful earth. God gave it to me. This is my land." Again, there are different ways of viewing this world and different ways of viewing our place in it. Some musings and food for thought today. I guess I'm going backwards now, am I? But I'm going to talk about 4 topics today. The first is give you a little bit about the roots of how Quinault Forestry began, and secondly, a little bit about the forestry program itself, and then some of the challenges that we're facing today, and lastly, a few closing remarks. A little bit about Quinault. Many of you may not know about the Quinault Reservation. It's located due west of Seattle, roughly 120 miles or so due west. It's on the Pacific coast. It's got a natural resource-based economy. The Quinaults are a treaty tribe. They signed a treaty with the United States in 1855. The reservation consists mostly of forest land, roughly 205,000 acres of forest land. The Quinault Reservation is the largest in western Washington. And the Quinault Nation is responsible for protecting the environment and stewardship of the land and resources. A little bit about the Quinault Nation. The Quinault Nation itself governs the Quinault Reservation. There is an 11-member business committee that's responsible for managing its internal and external affairs. And Guy Capoman, who you'll hear a little bit about later on in this presentation, is the current president of the Quinault Indian Nation. A little bit about the roots. Quinaults are peoples of the land and sea. Again, Quinault Reservation has roughly 220,000 acres. It's got two main villages located at the mouths of rivers that originate in the Olympic Mountains, Olympic rainforests, and flow directly into the Pacific Ocean. It's got a natural resource-based culture and economy, and really is the basis of its spirituality, its relationship to the land and the resources. The Quinault are dependent upon natural resources, the wildlife, the fish, the clams, everything from the ocean to the land and the rivers that support them. Quinaults have been stewards for countless generations, and they built an economy that's really based upon abundance and sharing, communal sharing and communal abundance. Its culture and economy were really sustained by fishing, hunting, and gathering. That was based upon multiple generations of learning, stewardship of the environment, which formed the cornerstone that sustained that culture and economy for many thousands of years. The Northwest tribal cultures, Quinault included, were tied very closely to Western red cedar. Western red cedar is lightweight, it's versatile, it's durable, provides shelter, and provides goods for spirituality. It's really known as arbor vitae, or the tree of life, which provided housing, transportation, fuel, clothing, basketry, art, food, music, fishing, and ceremony. One of the things that the coastal tribes are famous for is canoes and transportation. In the lower right-hand corner, you see a modern version of those canoes. Those are racing canoes that have modern outboard engines mounted in the back. And every 4th of July and the Tahola Days, which really celebrates the signing of the treaty, there are races held from the mouth of the Quinault River up to Lake Quinault and back. And these canoes go really fast. But they're not like the old canoes like you might see in the lower left-hand corner, the traditional form. There are many traditional forms of canoes that were formed out of western red cedar. One of the logs that you see there, just ready for carving.
Yeah, they're humongous. They go out in the ocean. I thought, yeah, okay. My family has always been known as canoe carvers, from race canoes, river canoes, so on and so forth. I got whalers in my ancestry that owned those and would go out in treaty times. So I was thinking that it was because of all of those things, that history. So I started researching, because there hadn't been an ocean canoe here in like 100 years. I traveled around to different museums and places where there were Quinault canoes, ocean canoes, from sealing canoes to the whaling canoes or the travel canoes, the bigger ones. I came back home and I got a chainsaw and axes and Cooper's adze. The big adzes with the lips on them so you can cut cross grain. We ended up getting a bunch of those and we roughed out the log. This old growth log or tree, it was 9 feet tall at the butt and it was 40 feet long, just big, but probably one of the biggest trees I've seen. And our first task was to split that log. So we had a guy climb up there. We had a 6-foot barred saw and we ran that saw all the way down the length of it. We went out and we found the biggest crab apple. It's really hard wood. And we cut these chunks off of it and we made these triangle shaped wedges and we start hammering them in there. And then we got great big wedges, like this wide and 6 feet long out of alder. And the alder's pretty tough too. So here's more timber. There's crabapple, there's alder, there's red cedar. We started hammering those in there. And that thing just popped. The ground shook when the two pieces fell. Boom. So we started to shape the canoe out of that. The tree, I wasn't there when it was selected, but I know that old tree fallers and tribal members, elders, were there to choose which tree.
Quinault Reservation used to be the home of some of the largest red cedar in the world. This is a photo of one of the trees that was on the Quinault Reservation when I first arrived there in the late 1960s and early 1970s. This tree was almost 200 feet tall, and it had a circumference of over 62 feet. Now, there's a cut of a Douglas fir in the back of this room that's 600 years old, and it's roughly maybe 5 feet in diameter. And that's tiny compared to some of the trees that once were on the Quinault Reservation. This particular tree contained roughly 15,000 cubic feet of wood. Now, Quinaults have been here a long time, really before the last ice age. There have been mammoth tusks have been found in clay banks of the Quinault River. You see on the right is one of the tribal members, James Shale, holding a 15,000-year-old mammoth tusk that was found in what are called the blue clay banks of the Quinault River. And in 1929, they found evidence of a carved 10,000-year-old tusk showing a mammoth. So they've been here a long time, been here before the last ice age. And that changed, with the Great Flood. And the Great Flood meant that the sea levels were rising and that the villages had to be relocated. But part of the Great Flood was not just environmental, it was a result of colonization, where European settlers or colonizers, really supported by something called the doctrine of discovery, brought great changes in the social, economic, and political systems that governed the Quinault and its territory. That colonization also brought disease and trauma. So roughly 90% or so of the population was lost to diseases like smallpox, influenza, and one of the things that also happened was the imposition of federal Indian policy on Quinault. And the Quinault Forestry has really been strongly influenced by vacillations in federal Indian policy. That started out with treaty making to really make the way for settlement. That was followed by assimilation efforts to force Indians to abandon their traditional life ways and values. Things like boarding schools that some of you may have heard of, where children were forcibly taken from their homes and moved to places where they were not allowed to speak their languages. Their hair was cut. They were forced to wear Western clothes. They were forced to learn Western values, and resulted really in the loss of multiple generations of Indian children. That was also accompanied by something called allotment. And allotment was a policy that was adopted by the United States to try to force Indians to abandon their communal ways of living and communal life values and styles in favor of individual property ownership, to make them become individual farmers and property owners instead of hunters and fishermen. And that era was terminated in 1934 with something called the Indian Reorganization Act. And the Indian Reorganization Act provided a foundation for and support for tribal governments. That didn't last very long, because in the 1950s, Congress passed Resolution 108, which called for the termination of relationships with Indian tribes. The United States wanted to get out of its obligations that it had committed to in treaties with the tribes in the mid-1800s. The last era, and the era we're currently in, is really one of self-determination and self-government. The treaties in the Washington area or something came about in the mid-1850s in the Washington Territory. The Washington Territory was created in 1853 from the Oregon Territory, and it really consisted of really Washington, Northern Oregon, parts of Idaho, and Montana. The name originally was the Columbia Territory, but that was changed because Congress didn't want to cause confusion with Washington, D.C., and wanted to call it just the Washington Territory. And between 1853 and 1859, there was the Washington Territory included Washington, Idaho, and part of Montana. But in the mid-1850s, territorial governor Isaac Stevens at the time negotiated treaties on behalf of the United States. And in those treaties, the tribes that occupied the land ceded millions of acres to the United States. And in return, the United States promised to set aside reservation lands for the exclusive use and occupancy of tribes. And the United States also promised to protect the tribal rights to fish, hunt, and gather. Here's just a graphic of the 5 treaties in western Washington that were signed by Governor Stevens. The arrow points to the Quinault River Treaty, which ceded most of the Washington coast to the United States. Well, what's a treaty? A treaty is a legally binding diplomatic agreement between distinct sovereigns. The tribes agreed to share or relinquish claims to lands to make peace and establish boundaries in exchange for U.S. promises. Now, the treaties can be negotiated by a designated official, but they have to be ratified by the United States through the advice and consent of the Senate before they can be codified and recognized as law. But it's important to understand that treaties are not a grant of rights to Indians, but rather a grant of rights from Indians to the United States and a reservation of rights not granted. So the tribes only ceded specific aspects of their territories and reserved their sovereignty and their rights and their inherent, that they inherently possessed. In 1891, the Quinault Reservation was originally established as one large piece of land. The area to the yellow there is an area that was erroneously excluded from the Quinault Reservation, and that comes into play a little bit later in my talk today. But the Quinault Reservation, when it was set aside as one large piece of land, was allotted by the United States into individual parcels. So the United States, instead of having one parcel of forest land, we ended up with 2,340 individually owned 80-acre parcels of land. Those parcels were held in trust by the United States for the benefit of the Indians.
To take the Indian out of us, and get us to think like the mainstream American. And I believe their thought at that time was to get us to think in terms of land as an individual ownership, right? If I give you 80 acres of land, will you become a farmer and not a fisherman? And will you separate yourself from your community and live on your homestead and away from the rest of your family? And the thing that makes tribes so strong is our connectivity to each other. And you could say we're all related. We're all related in the sense of we all come from a common place, and our ancestors came from that common place all the way back in time immemorial, and that's our connection. So I think that Dawes Act, the Allotment Act, nobody asked the tribe at that time if we agree with that. It was just, boom, here we're handing out these 80-acre allotments to all fish-eating Indians. So folks all along the coast, Washington-wide, Oregon-wide, we're all getting allotments here, whether we agreed with it or not. And finally, the tribal council at the time said, no, we want to screen everybody to see if they have any connections here first before you hand them an allotment. They were having folks come forth that they didn't even know that were wanting an allotment here, opportunists, and they were coming to sell their land to the timber companies, whether that's Rainier, Weyerhaeuser, or any of the big timber companies that monopolize this reservation for their bank accounts. So to prevent that, the tribal council at the time, 1900 to 1910, were starting to take an active role in who was getting an allotment here. But by that time, the damage was more or less already done, and 95% of the reservation was handed out as allotments. I believe we're at 70% ownership now as the tribe. Big deal, yeah. But it took a while. In order to buy land, you have to have money and the resources. And so the tribe over the years has been pursuing our economic health and finding resources to buy back land. They got to be willing to sell, but I'm going to tell you, I own a share on an allotment with 300 and something other family members. So the economic benefit of an allotment, I get a right-of-way check for $9. So there is no economic benefit. We're just landowners out here. And I say that coming from a background where I believe that the whole reservation is for communal use. It isn't just mine or hers or his, it's for everybody to use, and all our tribal members. The individualism of the Allotment Act is one of the efforts of the federal government to do tribes in. It didn't work here. Almost, but it didn't.
Now, one of the things that people may not know about the allotment practice of the Dawes Act, the real purpose of the Dawes Act was really to get at Indian lands that had been set aside by treaty. Because the Dawes Act provided that land that was not allotted to individuals could be opened for homesteading by non-Indians. And during this period, over 100 million acres of land that had been reserved for Indian use was lost to non-Indians. Now, Quinault has a long history of logging. Its timber resources were coveted by companies in the early 1900s. And in the early 1920s, railroad logging was started on the southern half of the reservation. Here's a photo of some of the railroad spurs and railroad lines that were built on the south, mostly the south half of the reservation, and on the northern half of the reservation on the east side. But railroad logging removed huge quantities of timber from the southern half of the reservation. And all of the logging was conducted by under the supervision of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was the principal federal agency responsible for administering the trust responsibility of the United States. Although the trust responsibility belongs to the United States, it was delegated to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Now, the BIA timber sale contracts, when I first went down to the Quinault in the late 1960s, they're in the midst of two long-term timber sale contracts, 30,000 acres each, covering about 30-year time period. And they became ultimately the subject of investigations before the United States Senate. Something else that happened around this time was the termination era that I spoke to earlier. This was where Congress adopted a policy saying the U.S. government really wanted to get out of its obligations under the treaties and its responsibilities to Indian tribes. Now, there were 60 termination proceedings that were initiated, many of those for timberlands or Indian reservations with timberlands. Western Oregon, the Menominee, some reservations like Quinault and Colville, where they resisted termination. Termination took a different form. And at Quinault, it took a form of what's called supervised sales. Now, most of the timber on the Quinault Reservation had been logged, but they had 2 long-term timber contracts, plus there was roughly a 30,000 acre parcel of land that was not sold as a single timber unit. That became really open for purchase by non-Indians. And after the supervised sales in 1976, you can see this little checkerboards. The red lands here are the lands that were transferred from Indian lands to fee lands, mostly owned by timber companies. That caused the Quinault to embark upon an aggressive land consolidation program. It recognized that it could not manage the forests and the resources of the Quinault Reservation on a piecemeal fashion. It recognized that the growing alienation, the non-Indian ownership of land on the reservation, was causing jurisdictional problems, particularly after Supreme Court decisions in the Brindale case on the Yakima Reservation, which tied tribal sovereignty and tribal jurisdiction over land ownership. Now, we knew that cedar was highly valued, both domestically and internationally, the markets. And we knew that the old growth was largely going to disappear. That the old growth heartwood was easily split as carved and was very decay resistant. So the cedar logs, when they fell down in the forest, would be there for hundreds of years, would be harvested later on. Today, Quinault does plant western red cedar, really between 70 and I think 130,000 seedlings a year on sites that are suited for western red cedar instead of Douglas fir or hemlock, which are mostly commercial species. The railroad logging gave way to tractors. We had big trees. Many of the trees on the Quinault Reservation were sort of one log loads. That means you had one log per logging truck. So these were big trees. This is the aftermath of two long-term timber sale contracts in the northern half of the reservation in the 1970s. 30,000 acre clear cuts with piles of logging debris left behind. We were still dealing with brush fields that were left behind in the southern half of the reservation because there were no allowances or provisions for reforestation. Our streams were clogged. It's not large woody debris that you want on the streams. They were clogged by logs, miles long log jams that were completely impassable to anything. So we had 60,000 acres of cure cuts. Again, 220 tons of logging slash per acre. Our challenges that we're looking at were virtually impossible to even imagine until you got out there. We were experiencing fires and brush fields and cedar salvage from some of the leftover timber that was timber slash and some of the cedar logs that had blown down over the centuries. And our allotment problems, ownership problems, were becoming even worse. So instead of having 2,340 individual 80-acre allotments of timber, we now have a situation that through fractionation of ownership, that we have undivided interest in each one of those properties. So we have as many as 200 or 300 undivided owners of each 80-acre allotment. And you kind of may appreciate some of the administrative challenges and burdens that causes. So I mentioned earlier that there were congressional hearings where they were investigating problems with stumpage rate discrepancies, that the prices that were being paid for Indian timber were much lower than the market. There were credit and payment practices that didn't take proper accounting for the proceeds. There were scaling and accounting practices from managing the timber sales on the ground that were problems. and they ignored sustained yield requirements. So the final straw really came about in the early 1970s when the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as trustee, decided it was going to further reduce stumpage rates for Indian timber. And that's when tribal leadership began to take action. Here's a picture of Joe Dela Cruz on the left and James Jackson on the right, who were two of the tribal chairmen and two of the tribal leaders of the Quinault Reservation at that time. They developed a vision and an action plan to attain it. So they expressed their concerns to the University of Washington and University of British Columbia, where I was studying, and talked about some of the challenges that they were facing, the damage to the fishery resources, the reforestation problems that they were facing, problems with equitable timber prices, and roughly 14 or 15 other challenges that they were looking at. So the prospects that they were facing, escalating management problems, diminished value, deteriorating resource and economic basis, conflicting individual needs versus tribal interests, and the challenge of managing the reservation's resources, increasing fractionation and fragmentation of ownership, and escalating costs of federal administration. So some of the actions that the Quinault Nation took, it closed its beaches to the public. So the Quinault Reservation has roughly 25 miles of ocean beach. Those beaches were being encroached upon, and some of the sacred sites were desecrated by tourists and other folks that wanted to enjoy things like surfing. Quinault also closed the reservation to timber sales. This is a picture of the closure of the Chow Chow Bridge. The Chow Chow Bridge was a major artery that the timber companies used to access the two large timber sales north of the Quinault River. So the blockage, the Quinault blockade of the Chow Chow Bridge spurred a great deal of media coverage and also set the stage for legal action. The Quinaults filed suit against the United States for mismanagement of its timber. Those cases became known as the Mitchell cases, and they established the basis for liability of the United States for breach of its trust responsibility for managing the resources. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the Quinault Forestry Program and how things changed in the mid-1970s. That changed with the implementation of a new policy called self-determination. In 1975, Congress enacted something called the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, Public Law 93-638. Many tribes feared that because they felt that it was just another word for termination. But it was really sponsored as a means to provide self-determination without termination. And under this law, tribes could develop and manage their own programs. It provided an opportunity, and Quinault acted quickly. I was working with Quinault at that time. We had a very small staff, but what we did was we looked at what the situation was, and we developed a vision with Quinault leadership. We put together a brochure called A Portrait of Our Land and presented this brochure to Congress. We described our concerns about how the BIA was liquidating the forests and what we proposed to do about it. Now, the cover of this brochure depicts a single tree, and that single tree is an eagle tree, and it was what was left behind after a large timber sale by the Bureau of Indian Affairs as protection for bald eagles. Well, Congress liked what we had to say and approved, and we established the first tribal forestry program under the Self-Determination Act. And we started a 10-year forestry development program under something called the Bureau, under the Forestry Development Program that was funded by Congress at the time. We also arranged for a site visit by the Secretary of Interior, Cecil Andrus, who visited the Quinault Reservation and visited firsthand to see the challenges that we were facing. As a result of Secretary Andrus's vision and visit, a number of changes were made. We were pushing for prescribed burning and other management measures to clear the land of some of the logging debris and logging slash. And after Secretary Andrus's visit, we were able to implement a prescribed burning program to preserve sites to prepare sites for reforestation. We also did a relogging program where we went in and relogged areas that had previously been logged and recovered roughly 35,000 board feet per acre is what we recovered after second go-around. But the core issue was really land consolidation. And we recognized that we really had to consolidate the lands of the Quinault Reservation in order to implement economically and environmentally responsible and sustainable forest management on the Quinault Reservation. That led something called the North Boundary Restoration Act. I mentioned that that portion of the Quinault Reservation had been erroneously excluded by reservation boundary error. That area was largely returned in 1988 in something called the North Boundary Restoration Act. And that act provided not only the restoration of the land, but it also dedicated the income that could be generated off the sale of timber from that land to be used to fund land consolidation and improve forest management on the Quinault Reservation. So that was the solution. It was to restore the north boundary and utilize the revenues. That was enacted through Public Law 100-638. The North Boundary Settlement Act enabled us to buy back a lot of the lands that had been previously fee lands. We now have only one large land of fee-owned land on the reservation that we're currently negotiating to acquire. So, on the left, you see what it was around 1988, the white areas of the fee lands that were there at the present time. On the right, you see the relatively current land ownership situation on the Quinault Reservation, where most of the fee land has now been reacquired. So, really, what's wrong with the status quo? Well, the status quo is really the existing state of things, leaving things as they are without modification or alteration. But there are many opportunities for limited resources to fund acquisition, and we needed to set priorities. So we set the priority needs, the visions, and the strategies, and the infrastructure, and set up the plans for financing restoration. The challenges that we're currently facing are those that are facing everyone in this room. The world is changing faster than we are. We're seeing changes in technology and information, and the world has really been transformed from one of abundance and sharing under tribal stewardship to one of manufactured scarcity and competition. We are entering unknown country. New knowledge and technology. We're seeing a new dawning, a new awareness of the importance of tribal worldviews and tribal stewardship and the political and legal presence and rights of tribes. New opportunities for businesses, food security, energy, renewables, those kinds of things, environmental, economic, social justice, and a reemergence of tribal sovereignty and legal rights. For Northwest Forest managers, there are new considerations as well. We're experiencing warmer temperatures, declining snowpack, drought, ecological and hydrological drought, increasing water stress, which are posing challenges for insects and disease infestations and wildfire risks. We're seeing changes in species composition and growth rates. We're seeing invasive species. Causes for concern: climate change is the single most important source of stress. For culturally significant flora, our traditional foods and medicines that have sustained tribal communities are disappearing from the places where they used to be. They're threatened by our inability to employ traditional ecological practices, by land ownership patterns, by jurisdictional restrictions, and by laws that have been imposed on the landscape. We're seeing obstacles for cultural preservation, displacement of tribal knowledge systems. There are many challenges for continued use of traditional knowledge, traditional science, traditional wisdom in modern approaches to how we manage the environment, how we care for the environment. We know that the current situation has led to decline in abundance and distributions of our foods and medicines. And we are very concerned about uncertainty of impacts over climate trends and variability. More people, more stresses on the environment, more energy demands, human population growth. But we're also working to address some of those challenges. We've undertaken things like restoration of ecosystem functions in the upper Quinault River to try to restore the functions that have been damaged by land logging practices and land ownership practices in the upper Quinault River that had really destroyed the salmon, the blueback salmon or sockeye salmon, which really were the core of Quinault culture. The spawning grounds of those salmon had been largely destroyed in the upper Quinault River. So we decided we're going to embark upon a long-term plan to try to restore that. So that plan involves engineered log jams. So we're installing really dozens of log jams in the upper Quinault to try to recreate some of the environmental and ecological conditions that form the salmon habitat up there. We are focusing on basic needs: food, water, shelter, and energy. We know that there are major challenges, again, that climate change is going to cause really unknown challenges, unknown deaths around the world that are needlessly being caused right now. And we know that that's going to be very costly. It's roughly estimates of several $billions a year by 2030, and that's not too far away. But we also know that these challenges present opportunities, and now is the time for change. The time is ripe for change. So, a few closing remarks. The Quinault worldview is one of oneness. We are not apart from the world, but we are part from it. We are part of it. And we understand that our vision can be myopic in these days, that, there's some people that think global warming is good, that, it's going to cut heating bills. And other people can't see the forest for the trees. Other people are going to resist change. Are they going to resist using the wheel when they had square wheels in the past? Because they're used to square wheels and they're too busy to change. But this much we know, that future generations of Quinaults and others are all at risk. We know that there are high temperatures and changes in the environment that are causing changes in all sorts of things that were going to affect us in ways that we can't really anticipate now. You might have heard about the 7 tipping points, the global tipping points. One of them has already been reached. 2 more are close to being reached now. Tipping points are sort of like knife edge places where even small changes in the environment can cause things to happen that are irreversible and almost difficult, almost impossible to predict. But our worldview is not centered on today and today's challenges. It's really beyond now. And in tribal communities, we think of this as a responsibility to honor 7 generations, to look 7 generations in the past, to think about our decisions today for the 7 generations in the future, really based upon notions of continuity and sustainability. Respect the wisdom and sacrifices of the ancestors, embrace the present, and create the future for the generations to come. The choice and responsibility for the Quinault Reservation lies with the Quinault Indian Nation. They either address these issues or they're going to pay the consequences that are going to come as a result. Now, the Quinault is well positioned for leadership. Its culture, its moral compass, stewardship and responsibility, its legal rights, its sovereignty, its political relationships, its knowledge and science, and its natural resource base, and its understanding of relationships to each other and to the world. The knowledge, traditional wisdom that's place-based, built upon by multiple generations, and it's augmented and complemented by Western science. That we don't ignore Western science, we embrace it, but we utilize Western science where it's appropriate, and we integrate it with tribal science. We know that there are new tools, informational webinars, seminars, things like this that help to spread some information and word, and that technology and policy developments are happening all the time. Culture is at the root. Interconnectedness of all things, the stewardship ethic, traditions, customs, beliefs, and practices for sustained use, avoiding wastage, principles of reciprocity, respect, and relationships. And the process of decision-making is really deliberative. It's participatory in tribal communities. It's not where you have some bureaucrat sitting behind a desk making all the decisions for the communities. The community participates in those discussions largely through roundtables, where everybody has an opportunity to have their say and everybody listens with respect and ultimately arrives at a decision. But it's based upon the world, that the recognition that the world and all its creations are alive and independent. And at its core lies tribal sovereignty, self-determination, and the Quinault Nation itself, by its constitution and bylaws, has the authority, responsibility, and the accountability to take action through its governance. The forests are principal to this because our forests provide water, they provide habitats for fish, wildlife, they provide foods and medicines. But our forests also have a fiduciary trust responsibility of the United States. So it's something that the Quinault Nation expects the United States to abide by and respect. We know that there are opportunities in carbon sequestration and markets. Things like the Climate Commitment Act here in Washington provide opportunities as well, and other challenges and opportunities. Just a few closing remarks. Again, everything's connected. We're at the center of a spider web, and at the spider web, all things are connected from that center. Our people and the land are one. Interconnectedness. Our forests provide habitats for plants and animals that provide foods and medicines for the communities. They affect water quality, quantity, and availability. And water affects habitat for the salmon that have sustained Quinault cultures and economies for countless generations. And the decaying bodies of salmon, the decaying bodies after salmon, provide important nutrients to feed the forests and help them to grow in the future. The world is constantly changing. Quinault homelands provide constant reminders of the forces of nature, resilience, and change. On the left is something that some of you may have visited. It's something called the Tree of Life. It's located just north of the Quinault Reservation on the Pacific Ocean. It's a spruce tree that you can visit from the beach. And the roots of that spruce tree are quite marvelous to see. It's quite a sight. And on the right, you see Tunnel Island. Tunnel Island is at the mouth of the Raft River, which is just south of one of the main villages of the Quinault Reservation. It's on the mouth of the Raft River. Tunnel Island was created roughly 5 to 7 million years ago. But one of its most famous features is Elephant Rock. And Elephant Rock looks a lot like an elephant, as you can see in the central picture there. But Elephant Rock disappeared in 2016. The trunk was lost. It's a sign of change. It's a sign that we understand that change is a part of life. The need for change is not new to Quinault. Quinault has faced unimaginable environmental, social, legal, economic, and political trauma before. Yet Quinaults have survived. They're still here. They still endure because they've learned to adapt by acting. Hopefully today I've given you a little bit of information to help you open your eyes, look around, and open your mind. Look around you because you may be surprised by what you see, and hopefully open your mind to new ways of thinking and new views of weighing your view in all of it. In the end, change is really all about healing. It's about healing our relationships with the earth and with one another. The forests that once covered the Quinault Reservation are gone. They're being replaced by the next generation. We're planting new cedar trees for the next generation. Quinaults are peoples of the land and sea. They're stewards. They're not just managers of resources or timber cutters or whatever. They're stewards of the forest, the fish, wildlife, plants, water, the air, and the soil to provide a better future for the generations to follow.
As the chairman of the tribe, the policy of the nation is to try to buy back as much of the reservation as we can from willing sellers and from fee lands to trust lands. To get back the nation ownership of the reservation has been a legacy project that's been left to us from former leaders. You have to continue to buy land, continue to buy land. So that's been a part of my march on council, and as the chairman, we have to buy fee land, put it into trust land in the nation's name. And because ownership of the reservation for management purposes, to manage the forest how we think it would benefit fish and other animals has always been our goal, because all those things are connected to us. We have to be able to do that, whether it be bigger buffer zones for fish, not log in certain prairie lands because it's a calving ground for elk, dismantling roads so that the hunters have to hop out of your truck and walk, protects the elk, ensuring that the areas are replanted right away to continue growth. I think those are all things that have been part of a policy of this nation to keep the forest as healthy as we can. I think there are certain parts of the forest that I don't want to log. I want to see units of nation ownership put into carbon credit and to just leave it there for 100 years and imagine what that's going to produce in those areas. That we haven't seen it because the whole reservation's been logged at one time or another. And in my lifetime, I've seen a regrowth, second growth, a third generation growth, and I've seen old growth stands. And I've walked the one up on West Boundary. And it's like a cathedral there. You walk in there and there's these giant cedar trees in there, you know. They're just amazing, beautiful. We have to conserve and buy back and manage and as it benefits the Quinault Nation. And not my generation, but the generations to come.
I mentioned there are many challenges that the Quinault Nation is facing, as are we all. But, you know, no matter how challenging, we can't hide from the challenges that they have to be faced. And it's going to take the Quinault government, the leadership of the Quinault Nation. You've heard from Guy Capoman a number of times during this presentation, and I think that the visions and worldviews of Guy and other leaders of the Quinault are going to hold them in good stead. It's going to take the Quinault Nation and sustained leadership and continuity. They've got the duty and authority to act. They've got treaty rights and federal trust responsibilities, and they've got political and economic relationships with the United States and with its neighbors. I've talked a little bit about Quinault forestry. There are some books that those of you who want to know a little bit more, there's a book called Land of the Quinault, which talks about a number of the resource programs that the Quinault Nation has undertaken over the years. There's also a recent book by the mountaineers called Salmon, Cedar, Rock, and Rain that has chapters in it from each of the tribes that occupy the Olympic Peninsula. And one of those chapters is devoted to the Quinault Reservation. It's important as well to understand that Quinault is only one of many Indian tribes with forests in the United States. Indian forests comprise almost 20 million acres of forest land now in the United States, and each tribe has its own challenges and own ways of addressing how it's going to go about caring for their forests and their lands. There have been 4 reports on the status of Indian forests and forestry that have been issued every 10 years under something called the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act. These are independent assessments on the status of Indian forests and forestry. Those are available on the Intertribal Timber Council's website. Thank you for your kind attention. I'd be pleased to respond to any questions that you might have.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really enlightening. My question for you is, I work with youth, specifically teenagers 14 to 18, who are incredibly impressionable and are really navigating a whole new world in climate change. And also I work with primarily South Seattle community, which is primarily BIPOC and underserved and overburdened communities. Especially immigrant and refugee communities. What would you say to these youth who are in high school and are, trying to figure out where to take their career path? How would you encourage them to go into stewardship and environmentalism over something that might be a little bit more financially lucrative?
What would you say to youth today that are trying to get into tribal or forest stewardship? What would you say to youth today that are trying to get into forest stewardship as a career?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understood your question, but you seem to be asking about Quinault Forest stewardship. And what it was?
Youth today, young people, trying to get into
Yes, yes. What we were trying to do at Quinault, you saw some photos of some of the young children there. When I first was at the University of Washington and began to work with the Quinault Nation, one of the things that we did was we established a program that actually we set up a direct link from the University of Washington computers to the Quinault Reservation. And we set up, probably way before your time, but it's, we had paper tape. We put our programs on paper tape. And we created computer programs to teach the youth about resource management, some of the fundamental principles there. And kids would come in after their school and go in and play, play with the little teletype machine and learn about resource management. We also have scholarship programs that we support and use to fund, for some of the revenues that the tribe is able to generate these days to support scholarships. We have internships. We encourage kids to go to school. Sometimes that's tough. So we're trying to find other ways of involving kids, because you don't need a sheepskin to care for the land. They have a lot of know-how, skills that they can learn by working with people, working with some of their other tribal members and some of the professionals that help the Quinault Nation, to learn from them. The way that we approach teaching in Indian country is different. It's not like you open a book and read all about what you need to know. That it's teaching by showing. And it's really sort of like a mentorship program where people recognize that they understand people that are serious about doing things rather than just wanting to go out and earn a paycheck, that they're serious about caring for the land and the resources and knowing how to do it. And they teach them. You teach them by showing. So you go out in the woods and you show them how to strip cedar bark, how to plant trees, how to clear brush, those kinds of things. So it's a hands-on kind of an approach rather than a book learning approach. So I mentioned earlier that we need to really think about new ways of providing that continuity and providing for people to understand what it takes to be a steward, a responsible steward for future generations.
I also want to say thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us tonight. And I am curious, I noticed in your presentation you pointed out that cedar is incredibly important to the Quinault people, and also that climate change and other factors threaten the ability of cedar to grow the way that it used to, and potentially its future. And so I'm just curious what the Quinault Nation is doing in their forestry practices to fortify the growth of cedar and protect its ability to grow in future climate. And also, if we continue to see the sort of climate change patterns that we've been seeing that threaten cedar, I guess what the Quinault Nation plans to do if cedar continues to decline.
What specifically is the Quinault Nation doing to protect red cedar in lieu of because of climate change?
Well, the way that we approach reforestation at Quinault is we look at the capacity of the sites. What sites are suitable for what species, and to the best of our ability, what do we think is going to happen in the future? The Quinault hasn't suffered a lot of the cedar burn that you see in other parts that are really caused by drought. Quinault is on the edge of the Olympic rainforest. The coast receives roughly 45 inches or so of rain a year. The interior part of Quinault, about 148 inches of rain a year. These were areas where large western red cedar used to grow. Most of that red cedar has gone. We have a few tribal reserves that have been set aside for some of the old growth for some mostly cultural purposes. But we're also planting young red cedar in sites that are most suitable for them in order to try to provide that tree of life, make sure that tree of life is there for future generations, and that we don't have a reservation that's just there for Douglas fir and western hemlock that's logged every 35, 40 years.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Do you see the larger scale land stewardship that Quinault does as fitting into food sovereignty projects for the tribe as well? And how would that be?
Does the land management practices, do they coincide with food sovereignty? As they're done today.
Well, Quinault has something called an integrated resource management plan. So it's not just about cutting trees, it's not just about managing a forest, it's about managing the entire environment, the relationships of the forest, the wildlife, fisheries, and those sorts of things. There are areas of the reservation and that are in prairies, something called prairies. We're trying to reinstitute burning of those prairies in order to restore some of the environments that are necessary to produce the foods and medicines, the Indian teas and the roots and berries, those kinds of things. So it's part of an integrated approach. So it's not one-dimensional. I'm not sure if that makes a whole lot of sense to you, but we have restrictions on how much of a given watershed can be harvested, for example. And we want to maintain the various seral stages of the forest so that we maintain the young seral stages as well as the older seral stages that are essential for different functions that we're concerned about.
Hi, thank you for everything. This has been so great to hear. Something I think a lot about is that we often, in a Western world, think of ourselves as separate from the land. But as Native people, we're really connected to it. And so I always think that when our land isn't doing too hot, neither are we. So as you've seen these forests come back, what impact do you think that's had on the Quinault Nation?
Sorry, as the forests are coming back, how do you see that?
Yeah, what kind of impact do you think healing the land has on healing our people too?
What impact does healing the land have on healing the people? Have you seen, as the forests come back, the Quinault people becoming healed?
It's not just about the forests, it's about the relationships. And as I got into a little bit, the policies of the federal government were really designed to break apart the communal relationships, the relationships that people have with one another and with the land. As Guy Capoman just said in his last quote, that we need to heal the land. We need to heal the relationships. And trying to undo some of the things that have been caused by allotment, by the boarding schools, really the destruction of tribal languages and tribal culture. So it's not just a single thing of the forests. Quinault has things like it's got a history program itself now. It's got a language revitalization program. Those things all connected. And there are still ceremonies. The Quinault, you may have heard about the canoe paddles in this area. The canoe paddles originated actually as an idea of one of the Quinault elders who thought that it was important to understand the discipline that was necessary to paddle these ocean canoes from place to place, and the relationships that are created by gathering people from many different places to share the food, to share the stories, to share the songs and dances, those kinds of things. So it's part of an overall revitalization. It's not just, hey, we grow more trees and everything's all fixed. That's not how it works.
Thank you. I love spending time out in the Quinault area. It's amazing. It's beautiful. I wanted to also add to that question. Are there current collaborations and organizations with the other tribes across the peninsula, just aligning on current conservation efforts? Anything in general? I know they all do the big paddle together every year, but just as far as strictly mobilizing efforts right now.
Are there partnerships between other tribes along the coast to do natural resource protection?
Yes, there's been really a revitalization of tribal stewardship, really all over the United States and Canada and the world. And part of my responsibilities actually is dealing with a lot of interjurisdictional matters. In 1976, I was one of the founders of an organization called the Intertribal Timber Council. And that organization was formed because it was a recognition that tribes in the United States were facing common problems with the administration of their forests. And it was a recognition that one tribe couldn't do it alone, couldn't fix the problems alone. It's sort of like you can look at the Great Seal of the United States, the President of the United States. You see an eagle, and that eagle is clutching a lot of arrows in one of its claws. It's not a single arrow, because a single arrow can be broken very easily. But many arrows together, very hard to break. The United States is formed, really modeled after the Iroquois Confederacy. And it was really the foundation that there needed to be a recognition of independent sovereigns that were confederation. The Intertribal Timber Council is now celebrating its 50th year. And part of that effort involves holding annual symposiums. So we move from place to place, reservation to reservation, so that we can see firsthand the kind of challenges that are being faced and how those communities are trying to address those challenges and to create a better future for their future generations. I also work, with the Pacific Salmon Commission, and with the Pacific Salmon Commission, we just signed a memorandum of understanding between the First Nations in Canada and Indian tribes to work together to try to share knowledge and experiences to help create a better future for salmon, a future with salmon, because our salmon are really facing some major challenges up and down the coast. So we try to find a way of sharing knowledge, sharing resources, learning from one another in order to try to find our path.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I can form a single question, but all that remind me of, I'm trying to link data centers to forestry and also climate change as a bigger picture. In the strategizing, and right, we've outgrown our our environment is outgrowing us, or whatever you said. The environment around us is changing faster than we are changing. What is like in the conversation when it comes to fire management, like we saw like in LA area, and also the human factors like data centers and the power imbalances of like tech, probably having money and taking the resources and being able to influence the conversations when it comes to the environment. I'm just really scared about like the negotiation and how much power and how much voice there is for stewardship and conservation.
How are tribes talking about data centers and the data centers and just
I guess like
the changing environment?
Yeah,
fires
urban
in
fires.
California, like these huge environmental problems and new tech challenges. How are tribes talking about that?
Well, there's a great diversity there. Data centers are very energy intensive, and some of you may be aware of some of the controversy that's going on in eastern Washington with the Yakima right now, where they're dealing with the pump storage project. So the pump storage is it's a technique where they pump water during times of excess power to a reservoir, and then when the reservoir, when they need the power, they let the water go. But that project is actually impacting sacred sites of the Yakima Nation, and they are very concerned about that. We're concerned about energy. We know that this area in particular, the population is projected to grow very rapidly, and that the energy demands are quite, they're going to be quite enormous. They're going to be beyond the capacity of our current system to handle. So we are looking at alternative ways, microgrids, to help stabilize some of the local systems. The Nez Perce tribe is actually setting up their own energy company where they're creating a network, a tribal energy network, to try to provide opportunities for Indian tribes to develop small-scale energy. You mentioned, I think, wildfires. Tribes have been extremely active in terms of trying to return wildfire to the land. Fire is a tool in any country. It's not an enemy. It's a tool. We recognize that it's an important part of the environment. It's an essential part of many environments, many forests that are sustained by fire. And many of the wildfires that are being caused today are the result of legacy management, of exclusion of tribal stewardship practices. The forests that you see on the land today don't look anything like the forests that were there upon European contact. The forests changed dramatically with the logging industry and plantations. So now you've got forests that are extremely dense. They're going to cause water stress. Trees are water pumps. And when you plant all these trees, these plantations, very dense, they're pumping a lot of water, and that's creating water stress. It's going to cause disease. It's going to cause insect problems. But tribes have been very active in terms of trying to return fire to the land. The tribes have used fire for millennia, for maintaining ecological functions, for warfare, to provide foods, provide habitats for animals that they desire. There are stewardship agreements that are being negotiated. I think the last time I took notice, there are roughly 80 stewardship agreements between federal agencies and Indian tribes, where Indian tribes can now assume a greater role in helping to manage the federal lands of the United States.
I think we have time for one last question here.
Does your forest participate in any of the forest certification schemes like FSC or SFI?
Does the Quinault Forest participate in any forest
Certification
schemes?
Like FSC or SFI?
FSC or FSI?
Yeah, one of the challenges with those systems is that they really do not recognize tribal values, that they're based upon other systems and other standards that are being imposed upon them. I led a study 15 years ago now, I think, where we looked at the various certification systems. And we went around the country and talked to tribes about what their views are with respect to that. You know, forest certification was really viewed as a means of maintaining market access. There really isn't any market premium for forest certification systems, so it's an additional cost. It's trying to provide access to markets. And what we found in our study was that if there was a need for certification, it should be a tribal certification system, one that's built upon tribal values and tribal management practices and principles, how they approach holistic management in terms of just timber production, something that you can put a label on and go to Home Depot or something and try to buy timber saying, well, this is from a certified forest. But if you go to those big box stores, you find that nobody really pays attention to that anyway. There's no market premium for it.
Thank you everyone so much for coming, and please give Gary a really warm round of applause. Thank you. And if you would like to revisit any of tonight's program, it will be available on MOHAI's YouTube channel. I know that there is so much amazing information that I will certainly be coming back to. And we will be back for our next History Cafe, if you would like to come, on March 15th, which is all about the Seattle mystic, Al Hubbard, who's called Seattle's